April 1, 1945, and Private First Class Michael Chen stands on the deck of a transport ship watching the coast of Okinawa emerge from the pre-dawn darkness, and he knows that this is going to be the biggest and bloodiest amphibious assault of the Pacific War, larger than Iwo Jima, larger than the Philippines. An invasion of a Japanese home island that is defended by over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and an unknown number of Okinawan civilians who have been mobilized into defense units, and told that the Americans will rape and murder them if they surrender, and Michael understands with absolute clarity that he is about to participate in a battle that will determine whether the invasion of Japan itself is militarily feasible, or whether the casualties will be so catastrophic that some other solution must be found. Michael is 20 years old, Chinese-American from San Francisco's Chinatown, and he joined the Marines in 1943 after his two older brothers enlisted in the Army, partly from patriotism and partly from a desire to prove that Chinese Americans are just as loyal and brave as anyone else despite the discrimination and suspicion that his community faces. And now, after 2 years of training and one previous campaign in the Marianas, he is part of the 6th Marine Division preparing to land on the beaches of Okinawa, the largest of the Ryukyu Islands, located only 350 miles south of mainland Japan, close enough that Okinawa-based aircraft can support the planned invasion of Kyushu and close enough that possession of the island will allow the Americans to establish airfields and naval bases that will make the final assault on Japan logistically practical. The invasion fleet is the largest ever assembled in the Pacific, 1,600 ships carrying 183,000 assault troops, and Michael can see ships stretching to the horizon in every direction, battleships and cruisers and destroyers and aircraft carriers and transports and landing craft. And the sight is both awesome and terrifying because it represents American industrial and military power at its peak, but also represents the fact that this invasion is expected to be so difficult that it requires this massive concentration of force. The naval bombardment begins at first light, thousands of tons of high-explosive shells pounding the beaches and the terrain beyond, and carrier aircraft roar overhead dropping bombs and firing rockets. And Michael watches this display of firepower and wants to believe that nothing could survive such bombardment, but he has learned from Iwo Jima and Peleliu and Saipan that Japanese defenders can survive almost anything if they are dug in deep enough, that concrete and earth can protect against bombs and shells, and that the real fighting only begins after the bombardment ends and the infantry goes ashore. The landing on April 1st goes surprisingly smoothly, the 6th Marine Division and the 1st Marine Division hitting beaches on the western coast of Okinawa near the town of Higuchi and encountering almost no resistance, and Michael wades ashore expecting machine gun fire and mortars and chaos, but instead finds himself on a beach that is eerily quiet, with only scattered sniper fire and no organized defense. And he advances inland with his platoon expecting ambush at every moment, but finding only abandoned Japanese positions and civilians who are terrified and confused and trying to hide from both the Americans and the Japanese soldiers who have threatened to kill anyone who surrenders. The lack of resistance is puzzling and vaguely ominous, and Michael's platoon sergeant, Staff Sergeant James Rodriguez from Texas, who has been fighting since Guadalcanal, warns them that the Japanese are planning something, that this is too easy, that the enemy has learned from previous battles that trying to defend the beaches against American firepower is suicidal, and that they must be planning to defend from prepared positions inland where American naval guns cannot reach them. Rodriguez is proven correct within days as the Marines push north and south from the beachhead and encounter the main Japanese defenses, a series of fortified ridges and hills that have been turned into fortresses, with mutually supporting bunkers and artillery positions and thousands of caves and tunnels that allowed the Japanese to move unseen and to emerge behind American lines. And the fighting that develops is even more brutal than Iwo Jima because the Japanese have had months to prepare and because the terrain of Okinawa is even more suited to defense than the flat volcanic moonscape of Iwo Jima, with coral ridges honeycombed with natural and man-made caves and with limestone that is soft enough to dig but hard enough to resist bombardment. Michael's division is assigned to clear the northern two-thirds of the island while the Army divisions push south, and the Marines spend 3 weeks fighting through terrain that seems designed by nature to favor the defender, hills that must be taken one cave at a time, villages where every building is a fortress, and valleys that are swept by Japanese artillery fire from positions that are almost impossible to locate and destroy. The fighting in the north is hard, but nothing compared to what is happening in the south, where the army divisions encounter the main Japanese defensive line, the Shuri line, a complex of fortifications anchored on Shuri Castle and extending across the narrowest part of the island, and for 6 weeks from mid-April to the end of May the Americans batter against this line in some of the bloodiest fighting of the entire war, gaining ground measured in yards at a cost of hundreds of casualties per day. And Michael's division is eventually pulled from the north and sent to reinforce the assault on the Shuri line, and it is here that Michael experiences combat that makes everything he has been through before seem like a training exercise in comparison. The assault on Sugar Loaf Hill in May exemplifies the nightmare of fighting on Okinawa, a small hill that from the maps looks insignificant but which is actually part of a complex defensive system where Sugar Loaf and 2 adjacent hills, Half Moon and Horseshoe, provide interlocking fields of fire that make it almost impossible to attack any one position without being shot from the others. And the Marines attack Sugar Loaf repeatedly over 10 days, take the crest only to be driven off by counterattacks, take it again and lose it again, and casualties mount to catastrophic levels as companies that start with 200 men are reduced to 50 or 60 effectives, and Michael sees friends killed and wounded in attacks that gain a few yards only to give them up hours later when Japanese counterattacks retake the position. The first assault on Sugar Loaf that Michael participates in happens on May 12th, and his company is ordered to take the hill at dawn, and they advance across open ground under mortar fire that kills men before they even reach the base of the hill, and Michael sees Private Tommy Garcia from New Mexico take shrapnel to the chest and go down. And there is no time to help him because they have to keep moving. And Michael reaches the base of the hill and starts climbing, using coral outcroppings for cover, and Japanese machine guns are firing from positions at the crest and on the adjacent hills, and the bullets are hitting all around him, kicking up fragments of coral that cut his face and hands. The slope is steeper than it looked from below, maybe 60 degrees in places, and Michael is climbing more than walking, pulling himself up with his hands while trying to keep his rifle ready, and men ahead of him are being hit and tumbling back down the slope, and Michael has to dodge falling bodies while continuing to climb, and it takes 20 minutes of exhausting climbing under fire to reach the crest. And by the time he gets there, half the company is dead or wounded. They dig in on the crest of Sugar Loaf, using entrenching tools to scrape shallow fighting positions in the coral, and Japanese artillery starts falling on them almost immediately, and Michael realizes that the Japanese have this position pre-registered, that they know exactly where to aim their guns, and shells are exploding on the crest and men are being killed by shrapnel and concussion. And within an hour they have taken more casualties on the crest than they took climbing the hill. Then the Japanese counterattack, soldiers emerging from caves on the reverse slope that the Marines did not even know were there. And the Japanese come in waves, throwing grenades and firing rifles and wielding bayonets and swords, and the Marines fight them hand to hand in some cases, and Michael empties his M1 Garand into the attackers and then fixes his bayonet and stabs a Japanese soldier who comes at him with a grenade. And the grenade explodes and kills 2 Marines, and Michael is deafened by the blast and feels warm blood running down his face, though he does not know if it is his blood or someone else's. The company is ordered to withdraw from Sugar Loaf after 4 hours because casualties are too heavy and ammunition is running low, and the withdrawal down the slope is almost as bad as the assault up it, with Japanese snipers shooting at them from multiple positions and Marines having to carry wounded men down a slope so steep that it is difficult to walk even without carrying anyone. And Michael helps carry Corporal Jim Kowalski, who has been shot through both legs, and they get him down the hill alive, but he dies in the aid station an hour later from blood loss, and Michael wonders what the point was of risking his own life to save Kowalski if Kowalski was just going to die anyway. But then he realizes that there is no point, that war is not about points but about doing what needs to be done in the moment, and not thinking too hard about outcomes. Michael participates in 6 more assaults on Sugar Loaf over the next 6 days, and each assault is a repetition of the first. Attacking across open ground, climbing under fire, reaching the crest, digging in, fighting off counterattacks, withdrawing when casualties become unbearable, and the hill becomes a symbol of everything that is wrong with the Okinawa campaign. Japanese defenses that are too strong to break with frontal assaults, but which cannot be bypassed or flanked, American tactics. That rely on firepower and courage but which produce casualty rates that are unsustainable, and a battle plan that commits fresh troops to the same objectives again and again expecting different results. By May 18th, when Sugar Loaf is finally secured, Michael has been in continuous combat for 17 days, has not slept more than 2 or 3 hours at a stretch, has not eaten a hot meal or changed his clothes or bathed, and his hands shake uncontrollably when he tries to light a cigarette, and he realizes that he is approaching some kind of breaking point. That there is a limit to how much combat a human being can endure before something fundamental breaks, and he is getting close to that limit. The rain begins in May and turns the battlefield into a swamp, and fighting in the mud adds a new dimension of misery to combat that was already almost unbearable, as Marines slip and slide on slopes that become too steep to climb, as foxholes fill with water that cannot be bailed out, as weapons jam because they cannot be kept clean, and as wounded men drown in shell craters that fill with rain and mud. Michael develops trench foot, his feet swelling and turning white from constant immersion in water, and the corpsmen tell him he should be evacuated, but he refuses because his unit has already lost so many men that every rifle counts, and besides he has survived this long, and has a superstitious feeling that leaving the unit now would somehow jinx his luck. So he wraps his feet in whatever dry cloth he can find and keeps fighting even though every step is agony. The Japanese begin using kamikaze attacks on a massive scale, hundreds of aircraft flown by pilots who have been ordered to crash into American ships, and while Michael is spared the horror of being on a ship that is hit by kamikazes, he can see the attacks from shore, can watch as kamikaze aircraft dive through walls of anti-aircraft fire and crash into destroyers and carriers and battleships. And the casualties from these attacks are horrific, with thousands of American sailors killed, and Michael realizes that the Japanese are fighting with a desperation born of knowing that they are defending their homeland, that there is nowhere to retreat to, that this is the last line of defense before the invasion of Japan itself, and that they will use any tactic no matter how suicidal if it inflicts casualties on the Americans and delays the inevitable invasion. The Shuri line finally breaks in late May after the heaviest fighting of the campaign, and the Japanese begin falling back to their final defensive positions in the southern tip of the island, and Michael's division participates in the pursuit. Fighting through villages and caves and ridges where Japanese soldiers who know they are beaten continue fighting anyway because they have been ordered to resist to the death, and because surrender is considered dishonorable, and because many of them genuinely believe that the Americans will torture and kill prisoners. The final phase of the battle is a grinding process of reducing the last Japanese positions one by one, using flamethrowers and demolition charges to seal caves where Japanese soldiers refuse to come out, and Michael participates in this grim work and tries not to think too much about the men being burned alive or buried alive in those caves, tries to remember that these same men would kill him without hesitation given the chance. But the screams of burning men haunt him anyway, as do the occasional surrenders where Japanese soldiers emerge from caves looking like skeletons, starved and wounded and finally broken by weeks of bombardment and isolation. Okinawa is declared secure on June 21, 1945, 82 days after the initial landing, and Michael Chen is among the survivors, though he is so physically and mentally exhausted that survival feels more like an endurance test passed than any kind of victory. The casualty figures for the campaign are staggering, with American losses exceeding 50,000 including 12,000 dead, and Japanese losses are even worse with 100,000 soldiers killed and anywhere from 40,000 to 150,000 Okinawan civilians dead. Caught between the two armies or killed by Japanese soldiers who executed civilians suspected of wanting to surrender or forced into mass suicides by propaganda that convinced them that American capture meant torture and death. Michael walks through the ruins of what was once a town and sees the bodies of civilians including children and old people, and the sight sickens him and convinces him that war is not just fought between soldiers but inflicts suffering on everyone caught in its path, and he begins to understand why some people argue that the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, while terrible in their immediate effects, may have actually saved lives by preventing an invasion of Japan that would have killed millions of Japanese civilians and hundreds of thousands more American soldiers. The Marines who fought on Okinawa are given a brief rest in July and August as they prepare for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, and Michael is training for this operation, practicing amphibious assaults, and studying maps of Japanese beaches, when word comes through that atomic bombs have been dropped and that Japan has surrendered, and the relief he feels is so overwhelming that he breaks down and cries. Because he has survived Saipan and Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and he does not think he can survive another campaign, does not think he has anything left to give, and the knowledge that he will not have to go through that again, that he is going home, that the war is finally over, this knowledge is almost too much to process after years of living with the assumption that he would probably die before the war ended. The journey home takes weeks, transport ships carrying thousands of Marines back across the Pacific to California, and Michael spends most of the voyage on deck staring at the ocean and trying to process everything that has happened, trying to reconcile the person he was when he left San Francisco in 1943 with the person he has become, and he realizes that he has changed in fundamental ways. That the war has burned away parts of his personality and left scars that will never fully heal, that he has seen and done things that cannot be unseen or undone, and that the challenge now is to find a way to live with these experiences, to integrate them into his life rather than letting them destroy him. He arrives in San Francisco in November 1945, and his family is waiting at the dock, and they embrace him and cry and tell him how proud they are. But Michael can see in their eyes that they notice the changes, that the young man who left is not the same as the man who returned, and he knows that the hardest battles may still lie ahead, not against external enemies but against his own memories and trauma. Michael Chen returns to San Francisco in November of 1945, receives his discharge from the Marines, and tries to reintegrate into civilian life in Chinatown, but he finds that the war has changed him in ways that make it difficult to relate to people who did not serve. And he struggles with nightmares and flashbacks and a hypervigilance that makes it difficult to relax or feel safe even though he is thousands of miles from any battlefield. He finds work in his father's restaurant, and the routine of cooking and serving customers is therapeutic, gives him structure, and keeps him busy, and gradually over months and years the war begins to recede into the past though it never completely leaves him, and he marries and has children and builds a life that is meaningful and productive. But part of him will always be that 20-year-old Marine struggling through the mud and rain on Okinawa, will always carry the memories of friends killed and enemy soldiers burned alive and civilians caught in the crossfire of a war they did not start and could not escape. The adjustment to peacetime is complicated by the fact that discrimination against Chinese Americans did not end with the war, and Michael finds that despite having served honorably and earned decorations for valor, he still faces prejudice when looking for jobs or housing, still encounters people who see him as foreign despite the fact that he was born in San Francisco and speaks English better than Chinese. And this reality is disappointing but not surprising, and Michael channels his frustration into activism, joining veterans organizations and working to ensure that Chinese American veterans receive the recognition and benefits they have earned. He becomes involved in the Chinese American community in San Francisco, helps establish a Veterans Association for Chinese American servicemen, and works to document their contributions to the war effort, because he understands that history is written by those who write it down, and that if Chinese American veterans do not tell their own stories, those stories will be lost or forgotten. Michael finds that he can talk about the war with other veterans in ways he cannot with civilians, that shared experience creates a bond that transcends differences of race or background, and he becomes friends with veterans from all branches of service and all ethnic backgrounds, and they meet regularly at VFW halls and American Legion posts. And these meetings are therapeutic because they allow Michael to talk about experiences that civilians cannot understand, to share memories with people who were there or who went through similar things, and this sense of community becomes an important part of his healing process. He discovers that many other veterans are struggling with the same issues he faces, nightmares and hypervigilance and difficulty connecting with people who did not serve, and this realization that he is not alone, that his struggles are not unique or shameful, helps him accept that recovery is a process that takes time and that healing does not mean forgetting but rather learning to live with memories that cannot be erased. Michael's children grow up hearing stories about their father's service, and they are proud of him, but Michael is careful to present a balanced picture, to make clear that war is not glorious or romantic, that the reality of combat is very different from the sanitized versions shown in movies and television, and that the psychological costs of war can be as devastating as the physical costs. He takes his children to see war memorials and explains what the names on the walls mean, that each name represents a person with hopes and dreams and loved ones, that war's cost is measured not in strategic objectives achieved but in lives cut short and families devastated, and he wants his children to understand that while war is sometimes necessary, it should always be a last resort. Something undertaken only when all other options have failed. He tells them about Sugar Loaf Hill and about the friends he lost there, about Tommy Garcia from New Mexico who was killed by mortar fire before even reaching the base of the hill, about Jim Kowalski who was shot through both legs and died bleeding out in an aid station, about Rodriguez the platoon sergeant from Texas who had survived Guadalcanal and Tarawa only to be killed by a sniper on Okinawa 2 days before the campaign ended, and Michael's children listen and cry and ask why such terrible things have to happen, and Michael tells them that he does not know, that there are no good answers to why some men live and others die, why some wars are necessary and others are not, why human beings cannot find ways to resolve conflicts without resorting to mass violence. Michael becomes involved in efforts to document Chinese-American contributions to World War II, recognizing that mainstream histories often omit or minimize the role of minority soldiers, and he works with historians and archivists to collect oral histories from Chinese-American veterans, to preserve photographs and letters and documents that tell the story of Chinese-American service in all theaters of the war. He learns that over 13,000 Chinese Americans served in the U.S. military during World War II, that they served in every branch and fought in every major campaign, and that their service helped overturn discriminatory laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act, which had prohibited Chinese immigration since 1882. And Michael takes pride in this history while also recognizing that the fight for equal rights continued long after the war ended, that winning the war did not automatically erase decades of prejudice and discrimination, and that Chinese Americans and other minorities had to continue fighting for recognition and equality for generations after 1945. In the years after the war, Michael Chen will become involved in veterans organizations and will work to ensure that Chinese American veterans receive the same recognition and benefits as other veterans, because discrimination did not end with the war, and many Chinese American veterans find that they are still treated as foreigners in their own country despite having fought and bled for America. He will attend reunions of the 6th Marine Division where the number of attendees grows smaller each year as the veterans of Okinawa die off, and he will give talks at schools and community centers about his experiences, not because he enjoys reliving the war but because he believes that future generations need to understand what war really costs. Need to know that the price of victory is measured not just in strategic objectives achieved but in lives destroyed and minds shattered and families torn apart, and that war should always be a last resort, something undertaken only when all other options have failed, because the cost is too high to be borne for any but the most essential causes. Michael Chen will die in 2012 at age 87, having lived long enough to see his children and grandchildren thrive in an America that has slowly, imperfectly, become more accepting of Chinese Americans and other minorities, and his obituary will note that he was a decorated Marine veteran of the Pacific War, but it will not capture what that service meant, what price he paid in sleepless nights and recurring nightmares and a sadness that never entirely lifted, and perhaps that is the nature of war, that those who do not experience it cannot truly understand it, and those who do experience it can never fully explain it, and so the reality of combat remains forever divided between those who were there and those who were not, a gap that no amount of words or images can bridge, and maybe that is appropriate, maybe some things should remain known only to those who lived through them. Because the alternative would be to spread the trauma more widely, to infect more minds with images that cannot be unseen and memories that cannot be erased, and perhaps it is better that the burden of these memories falls on those who experienced them directly rather than being passed on to subsequent generations who have their own challenges to face and their own battles to fight.